Josef Mengele, that is the name and surname that bears the signature of countless atrocities that occurred during the Nazi regime. This SS doctor played God with the victims of the Holocaust. His cruelty reached exorbitant levels, killing people to study their bodies after subjecting them to the worst torture. He even tied the breasts of a woman who had just given birth, just to see how long it would take for the newborn baby to die of hunger. However, unlike other figures of the Third Reich who had to face punishment for their crimes, this macabre character managed to escape, unleashing a long search.
There were many who believed that he could have staged a death. And there still are people who think that he's alive.
For several decades, his whereabouts remained a mystery. However, in the 1980s, his tracks led investigators to Brazil. Could this be where this angel of death was eradicated? If you want to know everything that happened to the brutal Nazi doctor, then stay with us, because we will travel in his footsteps in a new military history video.
40 years have passed since the fall of the Third Reich. But Josef Mengele, doctor of the Auschwitz-Birkenau concentration camp, remains at large.
There are sightings everywhere of Mengele, saying that he was in southern Spain, he was an island in Greece, he was in a Paraguayan jungle with a great big factory, he was everywhere but the moon, frankly.
Auschwitz is remembered as the largest extermination camp in human history. The gas chambers killed up to 5,000 people a day, in addition to victims of starvation, cruel diseases, and summary executions by Nazi guards. In total, more than 1 million victims lost their lives in the camp during World War II, and those who survived were scarred forever. Every time they closed their eyes, their minds took them back to the violent torture. Several SS doctors were in charge of the gruesome experiments, but none was as renowned as Josef Mengele, also called the Angel of Death. He was one of the main promoters of terror at Auschwitz. He was interested in genetic issues and sought to study certain groups in particular, such as people with dwarfism or twins. In the first phase of his experiments, he subjected pairs of identical siblings and people with physical disabilities to special medical tests. They were usually very painful, and they became a huge challenge for the hungry prisoners. The victims were photographed, plaster casts of their teeth and jaws were made, and their fingerprints were taken. As soon as all this was finished, Mengele ordered them killed so that he could move on to the next stage of his experiments, the comparative analysis of organs in an autopsy. Anatomical samples of pseudoscientific interest were preserved and sent to the Berlin Dahlem Institute for further examination. However, these cruel experiments never yielded results of real interest. The evil doctor was responsible for numerous deaths, and when the fall of the Third Reich was imminent, he knew that the worst of punishments awaited him. However, when the Allies knocked on the door of the Nazi regime, luck was on his side.
What saved him was that Mengele's vanity. When he had joined the SS, one of the things you had to do was have a blood type tattoo put under your arms, so that if they were wounded and unconscious, they would know what kind of blood for transfusions. He was fastidious, narcissistic, and he didn't want a tattoo, apparently.
Mengele didn't want to mar his body, so he never had that distinguishing feature of an SS man or officer, and that really helped him.
In 1945, in the weeks after the end of the war, there was a fairly simple test. Take off your shirt, raise your hand, and let the Allied troops search for a tattoo. When Mengele was arrested by American soldiers, he had no choice but to obey. The Nazi was among the men who were captured when the German concentration camps were liberated. He was taken to a prisoner's quarters, but because he did not have the mark, he was able to conceal his identity under a false name, Fritz Hollmann. In the days that followed, he was interrogated again and again. If there was a reasonable story in which the detainees saw themselves as victims of Adolf Hitler's army and not as cruel supporters of the regime, they were released. That was exactly what happened to the undercover SS doctor. When he was able to leave confinement, he returned to his hometown of Günzburg, where his family owned a major company dedicated to the production of agricultural machinery. The Mengele family were well off financially, which made it easy for him to find places to hide. However, his past haunted him constantly.
He was living in fear of being arrested. He saw what happened to, the Nazis in the Nuremberg trials, where all the Nazi leaders were tried, convicted, and executed by hanging. He knew, as a former Auschwitz doctor, that this could very probably be his fate if he was caught.
That fear inspired him to want to get as far away from Germany and the Allied hunters as possible. He was aware that someone with enough money could escape, and he was not going to waste his position. He soon managed to cross into Austria through a network of old SS members who managed false passports. From there, he crossed the borders again, this time to Italy. He managed to reach Genoa, which had been the destination of other Nazis looking for a way out of Europe. It was there that Mengele obtained an Argentine landing pass in the name of Gregor Helmut. With his new identity, he took a ship to Buenos Aires, a city where he arrived in August 1949. Little by little, Mengele found his place in Argentina. For a decade, he dedicated himself to selling agricultural machinery with the knowledge he had acquired from the family business, and his business prospered. Everything was going well, until on May 11, 1960, a commando of agents from the Israeli Secret Service known as the Mossad arrested Adolf Eichmann in Buenos Aires. The arrest of the SS officer set off alarm bells, and the ruthless Nazi doctor was overcome with paranoia. His world began to fall apart, and the only thing he could think of was to escape again. He traveled to Paraguay, where he managed itinerant farms for a year. Then he had the opportunity to cross borders again, this time to Brazil, where he continued with the same work. One day, Mengele came across a young calf that had a hernia. He took out his surgical tools and performed an incredibly delicate and successful operation. The farm workers who saw how he removed the protuberance from the animal realized that he was not really just a Swiss farm manager, as he claimed. The secrets he was hiding were pushing to come to light.
So Mengele grows increasingly isolated, depressed, and he ends up in a very modest bungalow on the outskirts of Sao Paulo.
Ironically, as Mengele's fortunes dwindle, his legend grows increasingly outlandish.
Throughout the late 60s and early 70s, the reputation of Mengele grows out of all proportion. It's partly fueled by Simon Wiesenthal. This is the Nazi we all want to capture. This is the really bad one. This is Angel of Death.
Simon Wiesenthal was a Jewish researcher who had been imprisoned in a concentration camp during World War II and later became a renowned Nazi hunter. He was one of the people who led the search parties for Mengele. However, he was far from finding him. In the 1980s, many were convinced that he was still in Paraguay. They thought he lived in a fortress in the jungle, full of guard dogs that barked at any stranger. However, the doctor had long since emigrated from that country. For more than 15 years, he had led a very simple life in Brazil. However, peace had left him, but paranoia did not leave his side. He knew that his unfortunate victims still remembered him and wanted him to pay for his horrendous crimes.
In 1985, on the 40th anniversary of the liberation of Auschwitz-Birkenau, Eva Kor leads a small group of survivors to the concentration camp they were sent to as children. From Auschwitz, they travel to Jerusalem, where they hold a 3-day mock trial of Dr. Mengele. 106 victims line up to testify against their Nazi tormentor.
I would say that it's probably the closest thing to making feel a person like an animal, like a nothing, like a piece of garbage or a piece of meat.
In May of that same year, all those people who suffered the savage treatment of the Nazi doctor were surprised by news. The German police had intercepted a striking letter that Wolfram and Lieselotte Bossert, an Austrian couple living in Brazil, had sent to Hans Sedlmayr. The latter was a former employee who had worked for Mengele's family, which generated enormous curiosity among the authorities about the content of the message.
With deep sorrow, I tell you of the death of our common friend.
That led the Germans to believe that Mengele had died in Brazil in 1979.
Sedlmayr is arrested. A search of his address book links Mengele to a residence in Sao Paulo.
The Germans contacted the head of the federal police in Sao Paulo, Romo Tuma, who quickly launched an investigation by searching the Bosser home. The family was shocked by the search by the security forces, who began to search the house without success. There was nothing to indicate a connection between the couple and Mengele. However, when failure seemed imminent and the search was about to return to square one, Tuma opened the doors of a cabinet and found a shrine to the Nazi doctor.
The family admit to sheltering Mengele during the last 4 years of his life.
And then they said where he was dead, and then where they had buried him. Mengele is buried just outside on the outskirts of a common cemetery where paupers are generally buried.
Still incredulous about Mengele's true end, the authorities began to investigate the Nazis' supposed death. It had occurred on January 7, 1979, in the small coastal town of Bertioga, Sao Paulo. It was a day like any other, and the Bosserts had managed to convince the German doctor to accompany them to the beach. Suddenly, the locals came across an unusual scene. A body lay in the sand. An older man had been spit out by the sea and was surrounded by silent people. No one made much effort to help him. It was obvious that he was already dead. However, a policeman who came to the scene tried a resuscitation maneuver, probably without hope, just as part of his protocol. What the agent did not know was that he was fighting to keep alive one of the most sadistic characters of the century.
Trying to resuscitate him. He had had a stroke. And if you have a stroke while you're swimming, the combination isn't great.
Dies in the water, either from drowning or from the stroke itself.
After the incident, the usual steps were followed. The transfer of the body, the death certificate, the identification of the body, and the burial. To prove the identity, they used the documents that the Bosserts brought. According to the doctor who examined the body, the person who was dead in the hospital morgue was 54 years old and was called Wolfgang Gerhard. The name that Mengele had chosen to hide under was not a coincidence. It was that of a man he had known who had died suddenly. This allowed him to keep his documents and move around without difficulty. However, the deceased did not correspond to some of the details. He seemed much older. In fact, he was 68 years old. Perhaps due to his poor physical condition for his stated age, it seemed natural that his death had been caused by a stroke that occurred while he was swimming. At this point, the Bossers discussed the possibility of cremating the body, which would have meant never finding any traces of the Nazi. But since they couldn't get any of the family to approve it, they decided to take his remains to the cemetery. There he was buried next to Gerhard's mother, maintaining the alibi until the end. After learning all this story, the authorities went to the place to exhume the body.
Even though Mengele's bones had been dug up, a lot of people thought that Mengele was still alive.
An international task force from Germany, Brazil, Israel, and America believe they have found Josef Mengele. Forensic scientists must now prove the exhumed corpse really is the Nazi doctor.
For this mission, a team of top-notch pathologists, radiologists, and dental experts was assembled. The forensic specialists set out to compare what they knew about Mengele's medical records and the evidence found in the bones. One of the ways to do this was to use the skeleton to create images that matched photographic records of the Nazi. This was the result. As disturbing as it was convincing for many of the professionals involved in the task.
We spent a great deal of time examining the bones that were discovered in this grave, and I am absolutely confident that the bones were Josef Mengele's.
But for undeniable proof, they would have to wait for the advent of a new forensic technology.
There was a lot of room for the doubters to think that actually maybe he's, still around. Maybe this is all a fix. And it did take really genetic testing in the early 90s to fundamentally prove to people that these were indeed Mengele's bones.
The doubts were completely cleared up when, in 1992, a DNA test was carried out on samples taken from his son, Rolf Mengele. It was determined that the bones were from the Nazi doctor from Auschwitz. There was no longer any doubt that the angel of death had died. The search of almost half a century was over, The body of Josef Mengele, the one from the macabre and inhuman experiments, was not repatriated nor claimed by his family. No one wanted sick people and fanatics to go on pilgrimage to the place of his burial, or to turn it into a sanctuary of perversity and evil. His fate was different. Dr. Daniel Romero Munoz, who was one of the people who headed the team that carried out the studies to determine the identity of the bones, found out that they had not been claimed. Thus, they remained stored in a box in the archives of the Institute of Legal Medicine of São Paulo. For this reason, he requested permission to use them in his university classes, and since the late 1990s they have been in his classroom. Thus, the man who killed and made thousands of victims suffer with his senseless experiments finally made his contribution to medical and forensic sciences, a terrifying paradox that the story of Josef Mengele leaves us with. And now, after having learned of the escape and death of this atrocious Nazi criminal, the time has come to say goodbye. Thank you very much for having accompanied us until the end. We look forward to seeing you again in our next military history video.